Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications. Please say hello to Senator Linwood Lewis. Good to see you, sir.
Hi, Woody. Always good to be with you.
Great. Short session this year, lots of things on the agenda. From your perspective, how have things gone?
Well, actually, it's been, as far as the policy aspect of it goes, it's been a pretty good session thus far. We've got a couple of more weeks to go. I expect that by the end of the weekend, we will probably have a budget, which is probably some sort of record for having a budget ironed out in conference. Yesterday, we dealt with tax conformity and what to do in the wake of the significant changes in Washington with the federal tax code, and that was done on a bipartisan basis. Obviously not what all the folks on my side of the aisle would have hoped for, but again, it was a compromise and a step in the right direction. So we've done some good things in that regard, and that's always the most important thing we do, is deal with the budget and financial issues. And then we're also working on some significant legislation. I think we may see no excuse absentee voting get out of the General Assembly for the first time ever, and that would be a significant step forward with broadening access to voting. And we've got the possibility of a real compromise product on nonpartisan redistricting for the first time ever. Now that's a little less likely, but it made it through the Senate with a significant bipartisan vote, and there seems to be an appetite for it in the House as well.
So that tax conformity measure that passed, that had to pass with at least 80% of the membership, as I understand it.
That's correct, and we need that emergency clause, which requires a heightened vote threshold so that it becomes law as soon as the governor signs it. That way folks can start filing and having their Virginia tax returns processed. They've been able to file, but the tax department simply hasn't been able to process them because they didn't know what the rules were going to be. And so now we've given them the rules, and they'll be able to start taking these things and processing them.
So what are some of the particulars? I know that there's a significant difference between what you can claim as a standard deduction, for example, at the federal level versus the state, the question of whether you can itemize deductions, whether you can continue to deduct state and local taxes, for example, in other matters.
Well, in the threshold question that we had to deal with was, do we conform? And that's always been a sort of matter of course, a pro forma, non-controversial thing that we do at the beginning of every General Assembly session, is just conform to the federal definitions of what income is, what adjusted gross income is. And so this year it had some controversy with it, because if we conformed, there was going to be a lot of additional revenue flowing into the state coffers. And so then we would have had policy decisions to make in addition to the conformity. So what we ultimately did, and again, this is not the proposal that the governor made, it's not the proposal that I would have preferred, but it's the best we could get out under the circumstances as to the configuration of the Assembly politically. And so what we have done is we have conformed, and then we have raised the standard deduction in Virginia from $3,000 to $4,500 for an individual. to $4,500 for an individual and $6,000 for a married couple filing jointly. And so that's going to result in returning about $390 million to about 2.5 million Virginia taxpayers. This fall, individual taxpayers will get up to $110 actual check for up to $110, and then $220 for a married couple. We've also created a taxpayer relief fund, so that monies that we realize from the changes in the tax code or from this conformity that we've made will go into this fund and can be used for other things, tax relief later. I suspect what's going to happen is next year when we get back here, we are probably going to look at the earned income tax refund and and doing something along the lines of what the governor has proposed in order to get that into the pockets of folks who didn't benefit so much from the changes in the federal tax code.
So he wanted to make that earned income tax credit fully refundable.
Yes.
Virginia does not do that.
Virginia does not. The federal return in earned income tax has always been fully refundable since its inception in the I think mid 70s or 80s. Virginia started its earned income tax refund a little later, but it's only a credit against your tax. You don't get the difference, and so that's what the governor proposed, and that would have cost about $250 million of the 530 we were going to realize from conformity. But again, we're going to have a pool of funds next year where we can look at additional relief to additional taxpayers. So about a third, it's really divided into a third, a third, a third as to who benefits from this. But there are a significant portion of taxpayers below $50,000 a year who will receive some benefits for this. All in all, this compromise, while again far from perfect and far from what our governor had introduced or suggested, is going to result in a more progressive Virginia system of taxation.
Now, what about the budget in general? I understand that there will be a pay raise for teachers, for example. There will be a pay raise for state employees as well.
Yes. We've got a 5% pay raise, this funding of the state's portion for a 5% pay raise for teachers. We've also got, and this is some of the details will have to be worked out in conference because the House has different opinions on these things, although I think the 5% teacher pay raise is fairly secure in both versions of the budget. In the Senate budget, we want to see a greater reduction in the number of students per counselor. We want to get it down to 250. I don't think the House has been quite as ambitious with their plans on that. That's very important. On the House side, we've got additional money going into the Housing Trust Fund to help with housing issues in the Commonwealth. And we've also got some money going into to the state bar to help with evictions and help folks, low-income folks who are facing eviction, help them deal with that process and have some adequate representation.
Yeah, there was a study recently that talked about the high eviction rate here in Virginia.
We have an unacceptably high eviction rate, and we're trying to wrestle with how best to deal with that. But one of the ways we think we can do it, at least in the short term, is to give these folks access to some legal representation and some legal guidance as they work their way through that process. And so we've got some significant money going to the state bar to help with those efforts.
And also a way for them to continue to maintain their rent payments while disputes are being settled.
That's correct,
as I understand.
and that's correct. So that's vitally important as well. It's bad enough that we have a housing crisis or housing shortfall and significant housing needs, but the ones who do have housing are getting evicted at an unacceptably high rate, so we have to figure out how to stem that tide.
I guess the other significant thing that has occurred and the governor has signed, and that's the culmination of the Amazon deal, so to speak.
Yes. We had a number of incentives that were provided to Amazon. If you look at the incentive packages that were being offered by our competitors, they were many, many times in value of what Virginia ended up offering Amazon. Some of the things that we've offered Amazon as part of which are technically part of this incentive package, were things we wanted to do and we're going to do anyway, particularly in Northern Virginia with workforce training and some cybersecurity issues and so forth. So all in all, it was a good deal. It's going to be a terrific financial boom for us even in the near term as these 25,000 jobs start to materialize. Not all of them will be in Northern Virginia. Some of them will be in Maryland and D.C. in the region, but a significant portion of them will. And so we're going to benefit tremendously from that.
And of course, those incentives are contingent upon those jobs not only being created, but filled at certain levels of income.
Absolutely. And we don't, by the time we have to fulfill our obligations under this incentive package, it will be a net generator of income. So actually it's not going to cost us anything until there's proof of what this is going to provide to Virginia.
Back to the teacher raises, to what extent could this have an adverse impact on some school districts that may not be able to afford to match?
Well, and the localities have to decide to come up with the match, and your point is correct. We just fund the state's portion of the salary increase, which begs a larger question. I actually had introduced a resolution calling for a joint legislative audit review committee study of the state's funding of education, of its share of education. The state's supposed to be a partner with localities. We're a terrible partner. and we haven't been living up to our obligations. And we have not had a state study of how poor a partner we are since 2000, almost 20 years ago. And so I propose that it's time to take a fresh look and a sharper pencil to that. Unfortunately, it didn't make it through the Rules Committee this year, but we're going to try that again next year too, because we need to know how much backfilling we have to do on our partnership obligations to our localities.
Now, would that also include an examination of the local composite index?
People are very afraid to open up a full examination of the local composite index. It's something that I have yearned for some time because it is very unfair, I think, to rural localities and I think to inner cities, which have many of the same struggles with their public education systems. I think the LCI is very unfair to them. The fear of that, though, is if we open up the LCI for a full discussion of all of its components and how they're weighted, there are other donor localities, particularly in our friends to the north in Northern Virginia, who may want to try and pull back some of the money that they're sending out and not getting the benefit, and by their view, not getting the benefit of in their school systems.
You mentioned school counselors and the ratio that's out of whack. I think there's a bill that will now require school counselors to spend 80% of their time actually counseling students.
Absolutely, and that's a problem. Coincidentally enough, in doing our pre-session school tour, Matthews County is one of our jurisdictions in the 6th Senate District, and I was touring the Matthews County school system and met with their counselor, who's a very dynamic lady and does a wonderful job. But she told me all the hats that she has to wear and all the administrative burdens that she has to carry, in addition to dealing with some significant issues in that small rural school population with the kids that she's supposed to counsel. And so that drove the point home to me that we really have to let these counselors, as much as possible, do what they're there for, and that's counsel these kids.
What about school nurses and psychologists? Is there enough support there in your local school districts?
No, there's not, and that's something else. Staffing in general for our public schools is woefully inadequate. And again, that harkens back to what we are doing at the state level to support these localities and their efforts to do what is the most important public function that I believe that I know of, and that is to provide our kids with a quality education. And if we're not being a good, solid partner with our localities, then we are failing in what is one of the most important functions of government, and that's public education.
Now, what about the continued use of school resource officers, especially those who come from law enforcement as a result of retirement, and there, to some people's views, a lack of sensitivity to what's going on in our schools today?
There is, and actually we've had a couple of bills, one of which I patroned with the administration and Secretary of Public Safety Brian Moran, to require school districts to enter into memorandums of understanding with the local sheriff's office or the local police force about resource officers and what the role of the resource officer is and is expected to be in the school system. Because oftentimes we put these folks in there to be resource officers and they don't have a clear understanding of what their role is insofar as am I just here to enforce breaches of the law, or am I here to help with discipline, or is it just strictly a security officer duty? And so this is going to make them sit down and figure out between the two of them exactly what is expected and what is capable of being delivered by the law enforcement officer as a resource officer.
Now, what about the physical condition of schools, especially in your rural areas? Because I know one of your colleagues, Senator Bill Stanley, has raised an issue about the conditions of schools in the Commonwealth in general.
Senator Stanley's taken a real leadership issue on this. He is the chair of local government on which I serve, formed a subcommittee to tour various school districts, one of which was in my district, Norfolk. We toured Maury High School and saw the terrific need there, between $60 and $90 million, depending upon whether you're talking about a rehab effort or a tear down and build new.
That much?
That much. So that's one school in one locality in this great big Commonwealth. On the Eastern Shore, Northampton County, struggling to figure out how to build a $25, $30 million new high school without the ability to raise the money to do that. And so historically that has been a local function, construction, infrastructure, but we've reached such a degree of need now across this Commonwealth, anywhere between $4 and $6 billion of infrastructure needs for K through 12.
4 and 6 billion.
Huge. The localities I don't think are going to be able to ever meet this burden unless we step in as a state and figure out some way to help them through bonding capacity, somehow, some way, to meet these great infrastructure needs. These kids can't learn when they have to dodge ceiling tiles and plaster. And so it's very important that we make it a safe and healthy place for them to learn.
Now, there's also been some discussions about the need in rural areas potentially to have teachers trained and armed. That differs. I mean, there are a lot of different opinions about that. That was an issue that was tabled, so to speak, by the speaker in terms of his school safety committee, but I'm sure you've heard about that as well.
I've heard about it, and it needs to be tabled and stay tabled. We just cannot start arming teachers, and I don't know that many teachers really want to be armed. And I think what we can do with school resource officers and trained personnel, and perhaps augmenting their presence, and other security concerns about making the buildings themselves safer and more secure. I think that's the path we need to go down, but arming teachers is not, that's not going to be a good thing long term.
Let's talk about CPACE. I know that's some legislation that you are pursuing.
Absolutely. Well, the 6th Senate District is the pointed end of the spear when it comes to sea level rise. Every jurisdiction within the 6th Senate District is impacted by it, and so I've been dealing extensively with those issues. And so one bill that we put in this year was designed to expand our CPACE program in Virginia. CPACE is an acronym, and it initially dealt with allowing localities to create a loan program for commercial properties to make them provide green energy, clean energy. And so what we've done is expand that, or propose to expand that, for resiliency efforts and sea level rise. And so that way, local businesses and commercial properties could, through this loan program created by the locality in conjunction with private lenders, apply for loans that could be paid back with their tax bill or with their utility bill over a period of time on favorable terms. And so that looks like it's gaining some acceptance. It got through the Senate with a fairly healthy margin. We'll see how it fares in the House, but that is yet another tool in the toolbox for localities that we're trying to give them for resiliency and sea level rise.
It's also a huge economic issue. It's a national security, military issue as well, is it not?
Absolutely. In Hampton Roads, with the military presence, it is, when you start having blue sky flooding, that is flooding without a significant weather event necessarily, and you start seeing the number of days that traffic into Naval Station Norfolk is impeded, that is not good. And so we need to figure out a way to be very proactive and get on top of this. And it's as much about sending a message to the military and to other people with economic interests in Hampton Roads who may want to invest or build on their existing investment, that we take this seriously, and we're going to give them some tools, the locality some tools to deal with it.
And of course, it would be a wasted investment that the Commonwealth has made to the Port of Virginia if we don't deal with these sea level rise issues.
The port is very sensitive to these issues because in the shipping industry, it's all about getting your goods from point A to point B in the most economical and reliable way. And if your port ceases to be a place because of sea level rise issues where that's less likely, then they are very unforgiving and they will take their business elsewhere.
Back to some of your other initiatives, real property assessments. I know you have something on that as well.
Well, we was fortunate enough to get through the Assembly a constitutional amendment last year, which will give localities the authority, should they choose, to provide real estate tax relief for those property owners, homeowners, and business owners who choose to be proactive and take resilience efforts on their own property. And so that gained some acceptance. It passed with 71%. It was on the ballot in November. And so now what we're trying to do, or what we've done this year, is the enabling legislation, which sets forth the guide rules. And so we've done that, and it's making its way through the Senate. And so the localities will have that, again, another tool in the toolbox on resiliency.
You mentioned an acronym earlier. There's another one I learned recently dealing with your Senate Bill 1666, RGGI. Talk to us about that whole thing.
RGGI is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and it is a primarily northeastern, although now mid-Atlantic, because Maryland is a member of RGGI as well. It's sort of a cap and trade system for carbon emissions. And so what we are doing, what Governor McAuliffe started us doing is, he started us by regulation through DEQ.
Department of Environmental
Quality. We are on path now to join RGGI. My legislation, however, would have allowed the Commonwealth to join RGGI, but would also have specified where the money from carbon allowance auctions would go. A significant amount would go to coastal Virginia for resilience efforts. some into Southwest Virginia for workforce training, and then also some for weatherization and energy efficiency programs. That is, thus far, this has been the third year I've presented it. This year was a little bit different because we focused only on where the money would go, not necessarily the RGGI membership in and of its own self. But we're getting there, and eventually we're going to be there. It will, again, provide significant funds for some investments that we have to make in Virginia, and also is good public policy as in regards to trying to get a handle on carbon emissions.
I was really surprised watching one of your committee hearings, the Agriculture Committee. The number and type of legislation issues that come through there is just truly amazing. Talk to us a little bit about the activity on that committee.
I have served on the Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee both in the House and now in the Senate, and I can tell you in both places it has a very heavy docket with a wide divergence of issues that you would not necessarily expect sometimes. On virtually every regulatory issue, coal ash this year passed through the Agriculture Committee. The RGGI bill, which we were just talking about, passes through the Agriculture Committee. Anything dealing with water quality, groundwater is going to be dealt with in the Agriculture Committee. So it's not just about cows and soybeans. It's about a lot of other important conservation issues and environmental issues.
Yeah, I was amazed. There was even one that the chairman presented dealing with floating duck blinds.
Duck blinds, yes. And duck blinds, like dog bills, are bills that you try to stay away from because they often engender a lot of controversy. And I think Senator Stewart's bill, when it gets to the House side, is probably going to run into a hailstorm of controversy.
And of course, we have the continuing discussion about who's going to regulate menhaden fish.
Yes, and we had it again this year. And eventually, we're going to strike a compromise on this, I suspect, and it may be next year because it is a perennial issue. This is my 16th session. I've been wrestling with it in one form or another for 16 years. I really do think, though, and I've changed over the years, my position on this over the years, I really do think in regards to getting the public trust in the process, in the regulatory process when it comes to the menhaden fishery in the Chesapeake Bay, that we really do have to shift it over from the legislature to the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, where we regulate everything else regarding the fishery in the bay.
And of course, people, I don't think, understand the contribution that farming and timber give to the Commonwealth. I mean, it's a pretty large percentage of the gross domestic product.
It is a huge portion of Virginia's gross domestic product, a huge part of our economy. And of course, again, the 6th Senate District, the 2 counties on Virginia's Eastern Shore, are first, second, third, depending upon the crop in production for soybeans, wheat, corn, all sorts of things over there. And now we're looking at trying to get into industrial hemp, which I think is going to be big for agriculture across Virginia, offer another product, another opportunity for economic development for those rural areas.
So what kind of crops you mentioned? You mentioned soybean, corn.
Soybean, corn, wheat, also cotton now on the Eastern Shore. All depends on what the market forces are. Cotton was there, had a reemergence a few years ago, disappeared, and now it's really come back this year. There's a large amount of acreage placed in cotton production.
To what extent has the tariff war between the U.S. and China had, especially on soybean exports?
It has been very hurtful. Now, you know, of course, the federal government, the Federal Department of Agriculture created this program designed to put money back in the pockets of farmers who were, particularly soybean farmers who were injured by this tariff war. And I don't know yet how that has played out as far as offsetting the damage that was done. But it has not been a good year or two for farmers.
Of course, timber is obviously used for housing and construction, but I understood at one time we were exporting like chips to the United Kingdom.
Yeah, we have. And the timber market, again, is very fickle. And that depends so much on availability from other places, on weather, on when they can get in and when they can harvest. And timber prices have been depressed for a number of years now, too.
State parks, I understand there was a bill that would allow the state parks to have charging stations for electric vehicles.
Yeah, there was. And I don't know how that bill shook out, but we're very fortunate in Virginia. We've got great state parks, a great system of state parks. And that goes back to a more fundamental question about how we used to, as a state government and the legislature, be proactive and invest in the future. Those state parks were an investment, and they have really paid off through the years. I know Kiptopeke State Park on the Eastern Shore, that former Delegate Bloxham before he retired was instrumental in creating and getting started, is just a gem, a small gem in the state park system that brings a lot of people to that area. So tourism dollars just flow from that.
Yeah, tourism, aquaculture is a big industry now as well.
Huge industry. We've had some bills working their way through this session. I was on the governor's work group studying the user conflicts. Anytime you have a burgeoning industry that's off the waters of some high-end residential housing, you're going to have some what they call user conflicts. And so we've had those, particularly in the Lynn Haven is where most of them have been, although they're certainly significant on the Eastern Shore where there's a large aquaculture presence now too. So we're trying to be proactive in that area as well and try and tamp down with some compromises the user conflict issue. And so we've had a couple of bills work their way through this year. Delegate Chris Stahle's patron one, Senator Monty Mason is patron one, and I think they're going to help again calm down that controversy.
Now, what about the health of the Chesapeake Bay? Is it improving?
Well, it was, and unfortunately the Chesapeake Bay Foundation issued its report a couple of months ago, its annual report on the health of the bay, and we dropped down either to a C- or a D, but fortunately, and Will Baker, who leads the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, told us, largely because of heavy rains and an unusual discharge from the Susquehanna. We've never gotten Pennsylvania to do what it should with the Susquehanna. The Susquehanna is a huge problem for us who are dedicated to bay cleanup. But this year with the huge rains, it was even more so. And so we think that is just a one-time unfortunate occurrence. But it also drives home the point that we are still just making incremental progress. We need to be vigilant and we need to be more aggressive going forward with the bay.
Got about a minute left, and it appears that the time has come for some type of commission to draw lines versus solely within the jurisdiction of the General Assembly. I guess the bill that has the best chance, because the chairman on the House side is carrying it, is the one, I forget the name. It would create a bipartisan commission which would be populated by members of the General Assembly.
Right, that's correct. And frankly, as you know, I've championed this issue for a number of years. My preferred methodology for nonpartisan redistricting is the Iowa model, which is the bill I've put in for a number of years. Virginia, One Virginia 2021, has come up with a different compromise version this year, patroned by Senator Locke and Senator Hanger. It's one that I signed on to. It's not my favorite, but I've often said, don't let the perfect be the enemy, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so this is the best. Our Senate version is the best we can do. I have a lot of problems with Delegate Colt's version. I'm hopeful that at the end the Senate version will prevail. And really, it is in the best interest of this Commonwealth that we do nonpartisan. We get into a place for nonpartisan redistricting as soon as possible.
Well, thank you for being with us, Senator Linwood Lewis. Good luck the rest of the session.
Thank you, Woody.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.